The champagne glass shattered against the mahogany bar, crystal shards catching the amber light of the Copa room like fallen stars. Dean Martin's hand trembled, not from the bourbon, though there had been plenty of that, but from the words that still echoed in his ears like a death knell. You sing when we say you sing, or you don't sing at all. The Sands Hotel casino floor buzzed with its usual midnight energy 3 stories below, but up here in Frank's private suite, the only sound was Dean's. Ragged breathing and the distant hum of slot machines that seemed to mock the silence. His reflection stared back from the black window, still handsome at 52, still the picture of cool sophistication that had made him a household name. But now there were new lines around his eyes, shadows that hadn't been there a month ago. The threat had come wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile, as these things always were. Salvatore Sam Giancana didn't need to raise his voice or brandish weapons. Like some street thug, his power lived in the spaces between words, in the careful placement of a hand on a shoulder, in the way conversation stopped when he entered a room. When Sam Giancana suggested something, wise men listened. When he made promises, they came true one way or another. Dean lit a cigarette with fingers that had steadied, muscle memory taking over where courage had faltered. The flame illuminated his face for just a moment, revealing the mask of nonchalance he wore like armor. Even alone, even terrified, Dean Martin never let the facade slip completely. It was what had kept him alive this long in a world where image was everything, and weakness was blood in the water. The phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence like a knife. Dean stared at it for 3 long rings, knowing who it would be before he picked up. Frank's voice crackled through the receiver, tight with the kind of controlled panic that meant serious trouble. "We need to talk," Frank said without preamble. "The penthouse. Now." "I'll be right up, Pally," Dean replied, his voice smooth as aged whiskey despite everything. Some habits died hard. The elevator ride to Frank's penthouse felt eternal, each floor marking another step deeper into a world Dean had never fully understood, despite living in it for the better part of a decade. The brass doors slid open to reveal Frank Sinatra, pacing like a caged animal, his usually immaculate hair disheveled, his tie loosened in a rare display of genuine distress. "They got to you too," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Dean nodded, settling into the leather chair that had become his usual spot during their late-night strategy sessions. The chair still smelled of expensive cigars and lingering perfume from countless parties, but tonight it felt more like an electric chair than a throne. "Sam doesn't make idle threats," Frank continued, pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon. "When he says jump, you ask how high on the way. Up." But Dean had been in show business long enough to know when someone was selling. Frank's bravado felt rehearsed, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Dean. The great Frank Sinatra, the man who had clawed his way back from career death and claimed Las Vegas as his personal kingdom, was scared. That knowledge settled in Dean's stomach like cold lead. The story had begun so differently, so full of promise and possibility, that it seemed impossible it could have led here, to this moment of reckoning in a hotel suite that suddenly felt more like a prison cell. It was 1960 when the magic really started, when 5 friends became something larger than life itself. The Rat Pack, as the press had dubbed them, though they preferred the Clan or simply the Summit, had transformed Las Vegas from a dusty gambling outpost into the entertainment capital of the world. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. 5 men who had captured the imagination of America and held it in the palm of their perfectly manicured hands. Dean remembered that first night at the Copa Room like it was yesterday, could still feel the electricity that crackled through the air when they took the stage together for the first time. The audience had come expecting a show, but what they got was something unprecedented, a glimpse into a world of masculine sophistication that most could only dream of inhabiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank had announced, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of authority and intimacy that made every person in the room feel personally invited to the party. Welcome to the summit meeting of cool. And they were cool, impossibly effortlessly cool in a way that seemed to mock the very concept of trying too hard. Dean would saunter on stage, with a cigarette dangling from his lips and a martini glass in his hand, looking like he had just wandered in from his own living room. His voice, that warm baritone that could make love songs sound dangerous and drinking songs sound romantic, would wash over the audience like aged whiskey. "Ain't that a kick in the head?" he would croon, and somehow make it sound both like a love song and a philosophy of life. The audience ate it up, these glimpses into a world where every night was New Year's Eve and every day was Saturday. The five of them had chemistry that couldn't be manufactured or forced. It was lightning in a bottle, that rare combination of talent, timing, and sheer audacity that comes along maybe once in a generation. They would perform for 2 hours, drink for 4, and somehow make it all look effortless. The show was never the same twice, because half of it was improvised, these 5 friends genuinely enjoying each other's company and letting the audience eavesdrop on their conversation. Sammy would tap dance his way through Birth of the Blues, while Peter mixed drinks behind him, and Joey delivered a stream of rapid-fire one-liners that kept the energy crackling. Frank would conduct it all like a maestro, knowing exactly when to let the chaos build and when to bring it back under control with a perfectly timed ballad or a gesture that commanded absolute attention. But it was Dean who became the heart of it all, the still center around which the others orbited. While Frank commanded and Sammy dazzled and Peter charmed, Dean simply existed, and somehow that was enough. He had mastered the art of appearing completely relaxed while maintaining perfect control, of seeming to care about nothing while caring deeply about everything that mattered. The critics called him the king of cool, but Dean knew better. Cool wasn't something you could claim or declare. It was something that happened when you stopped trying so hard, when you learned to be comfortable in your own skin no matter who was watching. It was the ability to walk into any room and belong there instantly, not because you demanded attention, but because you genuinely didn't need it. Those were golden days, when the Copa Room was the center of the universe, and they were its undisputed rulers. Celebrities flew in from around the world just to sit ringside and bask in their reflected glory. Politicians sought their endorsement, businessmen courted their favor, and women competed for their attention with an intensity that bordered on the religious. Dean's dressing room became a shrine to American masculinity. Expensive suits hanging in perfect rows, bottles of the finest liquor arranged like trophies, and photographs covering every surface. Dean with Jack Kennedy at a campaign rally. Dean with Marilyn Monroe at a Hollywood premiere. Dean with senators and movie stars and captains of industry, all of them drawn to his particular brand of effortless sophistication. The money rolled in like a tide. Record deals, movie contracts, television specials. Dean's name on a marquee was a guarantee of success. The album Sleep Warm went gold. Rio Bravo with John Wayne broke box office records, and his television variety show dominated the ratings every Thursday night. America couldn't get enough of Dean Martin, and Dean couldn't believe his good fortune. But even in those golden days, there were shadows creeping in around the edges, signs that not everything in paradise was quite what it seemed. The Sands Hotel wasn't just another casino, it was a playground for men who operated in the grey spaces between legal and illegal, between business and pleasure, between friendship and extortion. Sam Giancana wasn't just another fan seeking autographs and photo opportunities. He was the undisputed boss of the Chicago outfit, a man whose business interests included murder, extortion and corruption, on a scale that would have impressed Al Capone. When Sam smiled and shook hands, it was with fingers that had personally strangled men who had disappointed him. The first time Dean met him was at a private party in Frank's penthouse back when such gatherings still felt like celebrations rather than summits. Sam had been introduced simply as a friend from Chicago, and Dean had thought nothing of it. Chicago was full of people with money and questionable taste who wanted to hobnob with celebrities. What was one more? But there had been something different about Sam Giancana from the start, something that set him apart from the usual collection of hangers-on and wannabes. He didn't gush over meeting famous people or beg for photographs. Instead, he watched everything with the patient attention of a man who was used to being the most dangerous person in any room, celebrity company or not. "You've got a good thing going here," Sam had said to Dean that first night, his voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple words. "Real good thing. Be a shame if anything happened to mess it up." At the time, Dean had taken it as a compliment, maybe even a clumsy attempt at friendship from a man who wasn't used to socializing outside his own world. It was only later, much later, that he understood it had been something else entirely. A evaluation, a judgment, and quite possibly a warning. The relationship between the Rat Pack and men like Sam Giancana had grown so gradually, so naturally, that by the time anyone thought to question it, the bonds were already too strong to break easily. It started with small favors. Sam knew people who could get things done, who could make problems disappear, and opportunities appear. A troublesome reporter could be convinced to spike a story. A difficult business negotiation could suddenly turn favorable. A competitor's show could experience mysterious technical difficulties. In return, Sam and his associates gained something more valuable than money: legitimacy, respectability, and access to a world that had always been closed to men like them. When Sam Giancana walked into the Copa room and took his reserved table, he wasn't just another gangster throwing money around. He was Frank Sinatra's friend, Dean Martin's drinking buddy, a welcome guest in the most exclusive club in America. The arrangement had seemed harmless enough in the beginning. What was wrong with having powerful friends? What performer wouldn't want insurance that his career would be protected from the usual vicissitudes of show business? Dean told himself it was just networking, the same kind of relationship building that happened in every industry. But somewhere along the way, the balance had shifted. The favors became expectations, the suggestions became demands, and the friendship became something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably like ownership. It was Sammy who first voiced what they were all beginning to suspect during a private conversation in Dean's dressing room after a particularly tense evening at the Copa room. Sam had been making increasingly specific requests about their performances, which songs to sing, which guests to acknowledge, which political positions to support or avoid. "We're not performers anymore," Sammy had said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fear that came from growing up black in America and learning to recognize danger in all its forms. "We're props, high class, expensive props, but props all the same." Dean had wanted to disagree, had searched for arguments that would prove Sammy wrong, but the words wouldn't come. The evidence was mounting daily. Phone calls that had to be answered immediately, meetings that couldn't be postponed, appearances that weren't really optional despite being phrased as invitations. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday night in September, when Sam Giancana made it clear that their relationship had evolved far beyond friendship or mutual benefit. Dean had been preparing for his second show of the evening when Sam appeared in his dressing room unannounced, accompanied by two men whose presence radiated menace like heat from a furnace. "We need to talk," Sam had said, settling into Dean's chair like he owned it, which Dean was beginning to realize he probably did. The conversation that followed had been a masterclass in controlled intimidation. Sam never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat, never did anything that could be construed as overtly menacing. Instead, he spoke in the language of implications and suggestions, painting pictures of what could happen to people who forgot the importance of loyalty and gratitude. "You boys have done well for yourselves," Sam had said, examining his manicured fingernails with the attention most people reserved for reading contracts. "Real well. Course, success like this, it needs protecting. Lot of things can go wrong in this business. Accidents, bad publicity, problems with the unions, trouble with the taxmen. Lucky for you, you got friends who can help with all that." Dean had understood the subtext perfectly. They weren't friends anymore. They were employees, and Sam Giancana was their boss. The success they had built, the careers they had crafted, the lives they had created, all of it existed at his sufferance. And if they wanted it to continue existing, they would do exactly what he told them to do, when he told them to do it, without question or complaint. The realization had hit Dean like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him dizzy with fear and rage. This was how it happened, how free men became slaves, not through chains and whips, but through comfort and convenience, through the gradual erosion of independence, until you woke up one day and realized you were trapped in a cage made of your own success. Now, standing in Frank's penthouse with the weight of Sam's latest demands pressing down on him like a physical force, Dean understood that they had reached the point of no return. The game was over, the bill was coming due, and the price was going to be higher than any of them had ever imagined. The phone rang again, cutting through the tension like a blade. Frank didn't move to answer it. They both knew it would be Sam, checking to see if his message had been properly received and understood. The ringing stopped after 6 attempts, leaving behind a silence that felt more ominous than any sound. "What does he want this time?" Dean asked, though he already suspected the answer would be worse than anything they had faced before. Frank walked to the window overlooking the strip, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that had once suggested confidence, but now seemed more like a man bracing for impact. The neon lights painted his face in alternating colors, red, blue, gold, like a carnival mask, hiding his true expression. "Kennedy," Frank said simply, and that single word contained universes of implication. Dean felt the blood drain from his face. John F. Kennedy had been riding a wave of Camelot mythology since taking office, and his connection to the Rat Pack had been a source of glamour and legitimacy. For both sides, Jack Kennedy was Peter Lawford's brother-in-law, Frank's friend, and by extension part of their extended family. The president had even stayed at Frank's Palm Springs compound, cementing a relationship that had seemed mutually beneficial. But now Sam Giancana wanted something more than reflected glory and access to exclusive parties. He wanted the President of the United States to return favors that had never been explicitly requested, but had definitely been provided. Sam's people had helped deliver crucial votes in Chicago during the election, had used their influence to swing Illinois into Kennedy's column when the race was razor-thin. Now it was time to collect on that investment. "He wants us to arrange a meeting," Frank continued, his voice hollow. "Somewhere private, somewhere the Secret Service won't think to look, somewhere Jack will feel comfortable and let his guard down." The full horror of what Sam was asking began to sink in. This wasn't just about performing at private parties or keeping quiet about certain business relationships. This was about using their friendship with the most powerful man in the world to facilitate something that could only end in catastrophe for everyone involved. "We can't," Dean said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how naive they sounded. Men like Sam Giancana didn't accept "can't" as an answer, especially not from people who owed them as much as the Rat Pack did. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell that to Sam. Tell him we suddenly grew consciences and decided to be patriots instead of performers. See how that works out for us." The weight of their situation settled over Dean like a burial shroud. Every choice they had made, every compromise they had accepted, every favor they had allowed, it had all led to this moment when their continued existence depended on betraying one of the few genuine friendships they had left. Frank's phone rang again. And this time he answered. It on the first ring. "Yeah?" he said. And even from across the room, Dean could hear Sam's voice through the receiver, calm and patient and absolutely implacable. "I understand," Frank said, after listening for several minutes. "Yes, I'll talk to him. Yes, I know what's at stake." He hung up the phone and turned to Dean with eyes that had aged a decade in the past hour. "He's giving us 48 hours to set something up. After that, he'll find another way to get what he wants, and we won't be protected anymore." The threat didn't need elaboration. Without Sam's protection, they would be vulnerable to every enemy they had made, every rival who had been held back by fear of retaliation. Their success had created as many enemies as friends, and those enemies had been waiting patiently for an opportunity like this. The next morning brought no relief, only the harsh clarity that came with accepting an impossible situation. Dean woke in his suite at the Sands with a hangover that felt more like poison than the aftermath of bourbon. His mouth dry and his hands shaking with something that had nothing to do with alcohol withdrawal. The newspaper lay folded on his breakfast tray, and the headline made his blood run cold. "President plans Vegas visit for Democratic fundraiser." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Sam's reach extended further than any of them had imagined, into newspaper editorial offices and political planning committees, into the very machinery of American democracy itself. Dean's phone started ringing at 8 in the morning and didn't stop. Reporters wanting quotes about the president's visit, agents discussing security arrangements, political operatives coordinating schedules. Each conversation felt like another nail in his coffin, another thread in a web that was drawing tighter with every passing hour. By noon, the plan had taken shape with the inexorable logic of a nightmare. The president would attend the official fundraiser at the Copa room, but afterwards there would be a private gathering at Frank's compound in Palm Springs. Just a few friends, nothing formal, the kind of casual get-together that had been happening for years. Security would be lighter there, more relaxed. Perfect for the kind of conversation Sam Giancana needed to have. Frank handled the arrangements with the grim efficiency of a man planning his own funeral. Every detail was perfect, every contingency considered, every possible complication addressed in advance. It was the performance of his lifetime, a masterpiece of deception and betrayal that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely damning. The night of the fundraiser arrived with all the fanfare and excitement that surrounded any presidential appearance. The Copa room was packed with the elite of Hollywood and Washington, a glittering assemblage of power and wealth that represented the pinnacle of American success. Dean performed that night with a desperate intensity, knowing it might be the last time he ever took that stage. "Ain't that a kick in the head?" he sang, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, was about to be kicked into oblivion by forces beyond his control. The president arrived exactly on schedule, looking relaxed and confident in the way that only comes from never having had to fear for your life. He worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands and sharing jokes, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. After the official event ended, the smaller group retired to Palm Springs as planned. Dean watched it happen with the detached fascination of a man witnessing his own destruction. Frank was brilliant, keeping the conversation light and casual, making sure the president felt completely at ease. Peter mixed drinks with steady hands, and Sammy entertained with stories that kept everyone laughing. Dean couldn't bring himself to participate fully, couldn't force the usual charm and bonhomie when he knew what was coming. Instead, he found himself studying the president's face, memorizing the easy smile and genuine warmth, knowing that both would be gone forever once Sam Giancana made his entrance. The meeting itself was almost anticlimactic. Sam arrived at midnight, alone and unannounced, walking into the compound like he owned it, which, in every way that mattered, he did. The president's Secret Service detail had been convinced to Wait outside, told it was just another Hollywood friend dropping by to pay his respects. What happened in that room during the next hour would remain forever burned into Dean's memory. Sam's voice, calm and reasonable, explaining what he needed. The president's face changing from confusion to understanding to barely controlled rage as the full scope of the situation became clear. The terrible moment when Kennedy realized that his friendship with Frank Sinatra had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, that every shared laugh and private conversation had been a performance designed to bring him to this moment. Dean watched the President of the United States realize that he was trapped, just as they all were trapped, in a web of obligations and debts that stretched back years. Sam had been patient, had played a long game that was only now reaching its conclusion. Every favor, every accommodation, every blind eye turned to questionable associations. It had all been leading to this moment when the bill came due. The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. Within 24 hours of that midnight meeting, everything began to collapse. The first casualty was Frank's relationship with the Kennedy family. By Thursday morning, word had somehow leaked that the president had met with a known organized crime figure at Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs compound. The White House issued a terse statement distancing the president from any individuals whose associations might compromise the dignity of the office. Frank's name was never mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in Hollywood knew exactly who the statement was about. Peter Lawford, caught between his loyalty to the Rat Pack and his family obligations, made the devastating choice that would destroy their friendship forever. He called Frank on Friday morning to inform him that the president would no longer be staying at the Palm Springs compound during future visits. Instead, he would be the guest of Bing Crosby, Frank's longtime rival, and a man whose associations were considerably more wholesome. Dean was in Frank's study when that call came through, and he watched his oldest friend's heart break in real time. Frank's hand trembled as he hung up the phone, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of hollow devastation that was terrible to witness. 20 years, Frank whispered, staring at the phone like it had personally betrayed him. 20 years I've been building that friendship, and it's gone, just like that. But the personal betrayals were only the beginning. By the weekend, the professional consequences started cascading through their lives like an avalanche. Record companies began expressing concerns about the current climate and suggesting that perhaps it would be better to postpone planned releases. Television networks grew suddenly cautious about booking appearances. Movie studios whispered about contract renegotiations and insurance concerns. The Sands Hotel, which had been their kingdom for the better part of a decade, began treating them like unwelcome guests in their own castle. Jack Entratter, the entertainment director who had once bent over backwards to accommodate their every whim, now took meetings behind closed doors and spoke in the careful, measured tones of a man trying to distance himself from a toxic situation. Dean's variety show, which had been the crown jewel of NBC's Thursday night lineup, was quietly moved to a less prominent time slot. The official reason was scheduling conflicts, but everyone in the industry understood the real message being sent. The king of cool was no longer cool enough for network television. Sammy Davis Jr., who had fought his entire life against discrimination and prejudice, found himself facing a new kind of blacklist, not because of his race this time, but because of his associations. Club owners who had been eager to book him just weeks before suddenly had scheduling conflicts or budget constraints that prevented them from offering contracts. Joey Bishop, the group's master of ceremonies and resident wit, discovered that his carefully cultivated career as a television host was in jeopardy. The Carson Show, which had been regularly featuring him as a guest host, politely suggested that perhaps he should take some time off until the situation stabilized. The speed of their collective fall was breathtaking. They had spent a decade building an empire of cool, creating an image of invincible sophistication that had seemed unshakable. Now, in the space of a few weeks, they watched it crumble with the kind of systematic thoroughness that could only come from forces far more powerful than anything they had imagined themselves capable of fighting. Dean retreated to his Beverly Hills mansion, but even there he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, judged, and found wanting. The phone calls from friends became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Invitations to industry parties dried up. The easy camaraderie that had defined his social life for years evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. His marriage to Jeanne, already strained by years of his career-focused absence, began showing new cracks under the pressure. She had signed up to be married to a star, not a pariah, and the distinction was becoming more relevant with each passing day. Their conversations became stilted and formal. Two people, sharing a house but no longer sharing a life. The drinking, which had always been part of Dean's carefully crafted image, became something else entirely, a necessity rather than an accessory, a way to numb the constant ache of watching everything he had built turn to ash. The martini lunches became martini breakfasts, and the evening cocktails became evening oblivion. By December, the transformation was complete. The Copa Room, which had once been their second home, was hosting other performers, younger, hungrier artists who didn't carry the baggage of questionable associations. The reserved tables where Sam Giancana and his associates had once held court were now occupied by legitimate businessmen who paid their taxes and didn't require bulletproof cars. Dean's last performance at the Sands was on a cold Wednesday night in late December, playing to a half-empty room that felt more like a wake than a celebration. The audience was polite but distant, applauding at the appropriate moments but lacking the electric connection that had once made every show feel like a religious experience. He sang the old songs. Ain't that a kick in the head? That's amore. Everybody loves somebody. But the words felt hollow. Like echoes from a different lifetime, the smooth confidence that had once been his trademark was gone, replaced by a kind of desperate professionalism that fooled no one, least of all himself. Frank wasn't there that night. None of them were there. The Rat Pack had officially disbanded without any formal announcement, dissolving like sugar in bitter coffee. They were still friends, technically, but the easy brotherhood that had defined their relationship was gone, replaced by the awkward distance of men who had seen too much of each other's weaknesses and failures. The final blow came in January, when Sam Giancana was arrested on federal racketeering charges. The investigation had been building for months, but the timing felt deliberate. A clear message that the old arrangements were no longer operative, that the protection that had once seemed absolute was nothing more than an illusion. Dean read about the arrest in the morning paper over coffee that had gone cold and felt something that might have been relief if it weren't so thoroughly mixed with terror. Sam's arrest meant that the immediate threat was gone, but it also meant that whatever protection they had enjoyed was gone as well. They were on their own now, middle-aged, entertainers with questionable reputations and diminishing prospects, trying to rebuild careers from the rubble of their former glory. Years later, when journalists and historians tried to piece together the story of the Rat Pack's rise and fall, Dean would rarely grant interviews. When pressed, he would smile that old familiar smile and deflect with jokes, maintaining the facade of cool indifference that had served him so well for so long. But sometimes, late at night in his study, he would pour himself 3 fingers of bourbon and remember those golden days when they had owned Las Vegas and Las Vegas had owned the world. He would think about the choices they had made, the compromises they had accepted, the prices they had paid for a decade of feeling invincible. The bourbon would taste exactly the same as it had in the Copa Room, but the world it was consumed in was fundamentally different. The King of Cool had learned the hardest lesson of all, that coolness, like everything else, worth having, came with a price, And sometimes, if you weren't careful, that price turned out to be everything you thought you couldn't live without. The last time Dean saw Frank Sinatra was at a charity benefit in Beverly Hills, 5 years after that terrible night in Palm Springs. They nodded to each other across a crowded room filled with people who remembered their glory days, but pretended not to notice their current diminished circumstances. Neither man approached the other. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Nothing left to forgive that wouldn't require admitting how much they had all lost. Dean Martin died in his sleep on Christmas morning 1995, alone in his Beverly Hills mansion. The obituaries celebrated his contributions to American entertainment, his smooth voice and effortless charm, his status as an icon of mid-century masculinity. They mentioned the Rat Pack, of course, but only in passing, as a footnote to a larger story of individual achievement and artistic legacy. None of the obituaries mentioned Sam Giancana or that terrible midnight meeting or the price they had all paid for a decade of feeling untouchable. Those stories died with the men who lived them, buried beneath layers of public relations and carefully maintained mythology. The truth became just another casualty of the entertainment industry's endless capacity for self-deception and selective memory. But sometimes late at night in Las Vegas, old-timers would gather in hotel bars and remember those golden days when 5 friends had conquered the world and made it look easy. They would raise their glasses to absent friends and vanished glory, and for a moment, the magic would feel real again, the way it had when Dean Martin could walk onto any stage in America and make an entire room believe that being cool was the most important thing in the world. The bourbon would taste exactly the same, but the world it was consumed in would never be quite as bright again.